Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming and joining us today for this conversation between Tony Phillips, John Gartrell, and Anthony Neal. We decided to hold this conversation because everyone here is interested in changing an archive and establishing new forms of archive as well. I think everyone here also has thought a great deal about some of the questions that are animating so many conversations today around the ways in which we decolonize knowledge, the ways in which we change the curriculum, the ways in which we create fora of various sorts in which African American scholarship can be foregrounded as a way of changing the terrain of knowledge that structures both the university and public life. And so I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to be very brief in my introduction so we can actually get on with the conversation. And it doesn't come naturally to me to be brief with introductions, as some of you know. But I really am going to be brief with introductions today. John Gartrell has been the lead research archivist at the study of the legacy of slavery in Maryland in the department, in Maryland Department of State Archives. He's also been the head archivist in African American newspapers in Baltimore, Maryland from 2008 to 2012. And since 2012, he has been the director of the John Hope Franklin Research Center for African and African American History and Culture in the David Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at Duke. And I'm very grateful for you that you have come to join us today. Anthony Neal is James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies and Professor of English and also of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. He's also the Director of the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship. He serves as Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies. He is the author of 6 monographs, one of which, New Black Man, was reissued in a 10th anniversary edition in 2015. And in addition to those 6 monographs, he has edited volumes, numerous articles, and has conceived of blogs, New Black Man, the tremendous series Left of Black, which I'm proud is now under the FHI umbrella, with Eric Barstow helping Anthony Neal out with that. And his multimedia presence can perhaps be summed up in his role as the director of the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship. Our distinguished guest from the UK, who gave a talk yesterday, Tony Phillips, is a very experienced radio and podcasting creator, and his career has taken him from producing, reporting, producing, reporting, and commissioning editor of BBC World Service and BBC Radio 4, creating the Listening Project, to being vice president of the WNYC studios in New York, and to Broccoli Content Sony Music in the UK. His work really situates him at the center of so many important current debates on questions of decolonizing sound in the archive and thus the curriculum, on old and new technologies and their figuration of race, thinking about monuments, what to be done with the statues of owners of enslaved people or colonizers, and police brutality. These are all things that he's thought about a great deal, as well as working with activists and scholars in the field of African American studies over many years. And he has recently finished a series of podcasts on race and opera. And so thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. I'm going to just start us off with a very broad question. And And then I hope that you will have. I know that you will all have questions for each other. We will open it up to the audience for questions as well. My okay. So my broad question is about uh, the uh, uh, the scales at which you have to think when you are consciously trying to change an archive and put together an archive. And so I can think of a number of different scales. One is that you might want to, as I just said, change the way in which the way in which an archive is shaped in a local form. One is a question of technology that you are trying to engage and what the differences are when, for example, you're looking at manuscripts, letters, you're listening to sound, you are considering photographs. For example, I'm just sort of throwing those things out. And then the other is both the local and international scales that you are thinking of when you're considering creating or maintaining an archive. So Tony has worked for the BBC World Service, which is perhaps, the radio form that one thinks of as circulating the globe for a long time. Obviously, it has that sort of global impetus originally, and is known internationally. When we think about changing archives at Duke, we're thinking about maintaining a kind of scholarly. Well, I should let you say something about this, but a kind of a place in which scholars can come who are from anywhere in the world, but also has a kind of a local function and a kind of local pride to it. And when we think about a body of scholarship that needs to have perhaps greater circulation and a public interface than it would do otherwise through sort of the regular mechanisms of publishing and advertising, we're thinking about a different kind of sense of space that's involved. So those are some of the thoughts that I had thinking of the three of you together. I know that that's sort of a lot of stuff.
Your question was as long as your intro.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop speaking now, and I'm just going to let whoever would like to start us off.
We're going to start with you, Tony.
Well, my approach to archives is clearly aimed at audiences, and I'm thinking about one project that I did start in 2012, and I started. You mentioned it, Ranju. You mentioned something called the Listening Project. Mm-hmm. The Listening Project is something that I have wanted to do. I didn't know it was going to be called the Listening Project, but what I was interested in was something called StoryCorps. Mm-hmm. I listened to that from the time it started, and as soon as I got any kind of influence, in other words, when I got any kind of authority and power at the BBC, I decided to contact Dave Isay in New York. I came over to see him and I said, I want to do StoryCorps in the UK. And we were going to do it together, and in the end he said, you go ahead, take my intellectual property, take my idea, but do it your way. Do it a way that will work for the BBC. Now, the essence of it is really about giving regular people the opportunity to tell their stories in their way. And that resonated with me from the very first time I got interested in radio, because I was influenced very much at university by people like Studs Terkel. So Studs would talk to regular people, as well as international scholars, international artists, civil rights activists, Martin Luther King, Mahalia Jackson, but he was very much interested in the people who built things rather than just the architects. He's interested in the builders. And what comes to mind when I did the listening project is, yes, we rolled this thing out around Britain, but I needed a partner. The partner was going to archive these, and the partner in the United States was the Library of Congress. The partner in the UK, the equivalent, was the British Library. So when I went to the British Library, they kind of reluctantly agreed. And the reluctance was because we're not scholars. And they do archive, they do oral history in a particular way. And so there was a real clash because they weren't interested in the method that I was bringing forward, which was allowing people to tell their stories in their way, in their time. We would help the listener, the participant, tell their story, and then we would hand it over to them, and they would archive it. They pushed back and said, "Well, actually, we do oral history this way." And anyway, I won the battle, and we got the stuff in the archive. But there was always a frosty relationship with the British Library because we were not credible as proper classic oral historians. So I'm much more interested in just finding a way for people to tell their stories. This has all sorts of trails, I think, to going all the way back to those federal writers' projects in the 1930s when African Americans,
WPA, yeah.
that WPA thing, were being interviewed about their life stories, and it was about really are they telling their stories in the way that was authentic? Do you see where I'm going with this?
Right, because they're mainly being interviewed by white folks, and are they telling white folks a story that they think white folks want to hear as opposed to what the actual story is? Yeah.
So so it's that kind of authenticity that I was after, but it seemed to be at odds with the keepers of the archive at the British Library.
I guess I'll go next. I'm not at all surprised by the British Library looking at you a little funky when you present this idea of this body of work that has the voices of people that more than likely would never show up in the library. And I think for someone like myself who's been in archives for almost 20 years now, what we've seen in the field is a democratization of archiving that the field never really intended. So I think the first thing you have to start with that I think about often, and I talk to students about when they come to the Rubenstein Library for like instruction sessions, is that traditional archives in and of themselves are fragments. So there's never really a complete record because more often than not, you'll get a single person's papers. And so if someone sent them a letter, they have that copy, but you won't see what they said back unless they just were so meticulous that they kept that for themselves. So there's that's the starting point, that traditional archives were never meant to keep everything ever written by anybody, that for the most part, they were interested in chronicling the history of rich, white, heterosexual men. So, like, full stop. So if you compound that with anything that's outside of that paradigm, black, queer, woman, differently abled, you're going to get an even smaller fraction of what the fraction that's there. And so to your question about how do you change it, what we've seen is that there's more emphasis on the peoples whose voices are missing, taking it upon themselves to archive their own stuff. And the other part of that is that more often than not, they don't have trust in those traditional institutions, and those traditional institutions have been late to the party of opening their doors to those people, those kinds of people that are outside of that paradigm, to have their materials there. So one way that I've thought a little bit about change in that is, one, sort of just letting people know that you have the power and the agency to have your materials, your story, wherever you want. So and part of my day to day is reaching out to people and talking to them about their mother's papers, their grandfather's papers, or whatever collection of material that they have. And the first question that I typically ask is, well, what do you want this archive to do? And as opposed to, well, just give it to me, I kind of view myself as like a guide in the process more so than like a collector. I don't really like that term because you know, um, it sounds like I'm taking advantage of somebody, frankly. So one way that you change that is you sort of give people an understanding of how archives actually traditionally function, and then you let them sit with that, and then you come back and say, okay, well then what do you want your archive to do? And then you come back and say, okay, does this feel like a good match? So the things that I often tell people is, what's really, really important is that someone at that institution, I'm just speaking in terms of institutions now. This is outside of the scope. We can get more into what happens outside of it. But somebody has to be there that knows that your stuff is there, that cares that that stuff is there, and that cares about building on what you have inserted into that archive. Because more often than not, things can get lost when it's just like a single collection. But what's really impactful is when you can pair like-minded or like subject materials together, and now you have like a corpus of materials on a particular topic. And I'm not sure what the model is in the UK, but at least in America, you'll have archives that specialize in particular topics. So okay, well, if I want to go to get a certain subject like women's history, I'm gonna go to the Schlesinger, or I'm gonna go to the Sally Bingham Center right here at Duke. So the way that I've started out going about changing is giving people the plays before we even talk about, well, whether or not it comes to Duke. I enjoy my job here, but I often tell people, I don't care if it comes here. I just want you to save it. Because if you don't save it, then we can't tell the story. And that's what's really most important from my perspective.
When we launched, myself, Camille Jackson, Catherine Angst, when we launched Left of Black in 2010, I didn't really think of it as an archival project. There were two primary motivations. I grew up in New York City and was blessed to be able to witness the work of Gil Noble, who was a New York City journalist who did a show for 30 years called Like It Is, a public affairs show. The first videos that I saw of Malcolm X, folks like Paul Robeson, I saw on Like It Is. So I always wanted, one, to have access to that archive of work, but I also felt as though there was something missing in the culture at the time like that. The other motivation is that I think, for me, as early as 2010, I could feel the corporatization of Black knowledge production. And by that, I meant the way that certain Black authors were going to be championed by the mainstream publications, publishing houses, in concert with popular media, right? And even the national public radio, in terms of public radio, right there were going to be a small group of folks whose work was always going to be pushed and championed. And I knew that Black Studies, because Left to Black is a Black Studies project, was so much more broader than that. So I wanted to be able to have a platform for folks who were doing Black Studies work outside of the mainstream, right? Particularly folks who are doing work with university presses, and university presses themselves struggle to promote certain kind of authors, and et cetera. It didn't become an archival project to me until I started initially working with Catherine Anks. And this is before folks started to talk about podcast. I think if we had launched Left to Black in 2013, it would have been an audio podcast. Because that wasn't a frame for me, we always thought in the context of video. And Skype was this new technology at the time that allowed us to bring people to us. And if you see the early seasons 1, 2, 3, first through three, it's literally a giant monitor next to me, as if the person is sitting there with me. And what Catherine's skill set was in terms of shooting the show is that as we would mention various things, she'd bring in archival ephemera. So if we mentioned a person, we'd see a photo, we'd see footage, and that's when we realized, no, this has to be maintained a video, a visual aspect, because it's not just about the conversation, what we're talking about, but it's all this archival material, right, that we're also embedding in the context of the conversation. And then when it began to become an archive in and of itself, when folks started to tell us, well, I use this in the class, or individual scholars begin to say, well, I got this interview from NPR or this place because they saw a Left to Black episode with my work, right? I got invited to give job talks because of those things. And I'm thankful that in the early years, the first year in particular, the struggle of trying to get, as we talked about beforehand, episodes out before that, we wanted to make sure it came out every week, and we were doing one a week. Right, so we would shoot, and then inevitably something would happen. Okay, what are we going to do this week? We're going to have an episode. So we started thinking intuitively about bunching them together. So doing 10 episodes over the course of 3 weeks. So we'd always have an archive, right, that we could roll out. And our strategy was always an evergreen strategy. We never did news topical subjects, right? We weren't a news show. Right, that's not what we were doing. Right, we weren't trying to intervene in in a contemporary conversation in which the archive would not have any real value. 2 weeks later, right? So it was always book based. It was always about building an archive of conversation about Black studies. And now, 400 episodes later, 13 seasons, right? It actually helped me rethink about the idea of what an archive can be. Much later in the process of doing the show, when I became more engaged with the work of John Aconfer, obviously as a contemporary filmmaking, but the early work of the Black Audio Collective, right? And the way that they utilize whatever they could get access to, right? When you read the story of them, they're filmmakers, right? But they can't afford to do film, right? There's no digital platform yet to do this. So they would buy books from take books out of the library. They would buy books from used bookstores, take photos of the pictures in the books, and then give the books back, right? Sell the books back. And then they would stream together all these images of the photos and play music in behind, right? That was their early filmmaking project. And that was the other thing that I appreciated, and something that you brought up even too, John, John, this idea of archival work being a guerrilla project. Right, using whatever resources you have access to, and from a Black perspective, we know that, right? We know about our grandmas and grandfathers who keep all the archival family material under the bed, in a closet, in a steel lockbox, right? They have no plan to do anything with it, but they know that they need to save, right, what they've collected.
If I could jump in, I think what both of you are speaking to is really how a lot of Black archives start, is that, well, I would say people of color archives more broadly, but that you recognize that there are people whose voices aren't readily accessible. And these people have stories, or they're just dope people, and somebody needs to capture their story. And so from the perspective of someone who's like a curator, and I have a lot of like Black curatorial friends, we talk a lot about how you just kind of have to have an eye for understanding that. Thankfully, I work in an institution where I have the ability to say, like, no, this is really valuable. But a lot of my colleagues have to prove the value, similar to what you had to do with the British Library, and saying, no, this is really important, and here's why.
Well, it was the other component to this is that before we launched, we had a focus group of listeners, potential contributors, I should say, and it was in one of those situations where we're in a room, I could see them, they couldn't see me, and the company was arranging this, had asked them all a certain number of questions about the project and would they take part and is there a value in this? And it was a mixed group of people. But I joined about 10 minutes after it had started, and there was a school teacher who said, is this just another example of the BBC taking our stories? And I was like, oh, okay. So there's pushback against the BBC. And I said to the person who was leading this, I said, well, have you told them that their archive is going to go to the British Library? And he said, I don't think we did start like that. We just said it's a BBC project. And I said, you get the person in here, let's tell them it's not just us. And when they went back in and said, it's not just the BBC, it's going to be archived for the nation. That's when people went, oh, why didn't you say that in the first place? In other words, the BBC is not necessarily, people don't, beat a path to the BBC because it's the BBC. What was at stake here is that people felt that they would share and that they would give if there's a greater cause, if there's something for the nation, something for their grandchildren in 50 years' time to go to, if there's something in 70 years' time. In other words, if there's something there in perpetuity, that had much more meaning than, it's going to be on the World Service or it's going to be on Radio 4 next week. That didn't really interest people. And that really pleased me because I knew then that I'd got to a place where I knew that this was something that was aimed at people and not aimed at an institution imposing themselves with their history and their weight and their power on people. So the whole essence of this was to provide space for people to share, for people to talk. And that, I think, it's the hardest thing to do. It's the hardest thing to get right. But I think it's also the way of getting the most out of an archive because it feels that it's come naturally and organically from us, from people.
Let me ask you, John, does Duke function in that same way in terms of folks being wary? I'm thinking particularly of our colleagues up at Penn and the struggles they're having now, very public demonstrations about them having the remains of MOVE members, right, who died in the MOVE bombing. And on some level, there's no rationale for the university to have those remains. Right. When you approach folks about, we'd like to bring this to the Duke Archive, the John Hope Franklin Research Center, what are some of the responses of folks? Are they hesitant? Do they wonder about what the university is going? Is the university going to care for it the way that they would like to be it cared for?
I would say there's always a layer of hesitancy. And I often tell people that when I give people my card and it says Duke University on it, that door is either going to open or close. And I'm not sure which way it's going to swing. And so, yes, there is hesitancy from some folks, not everybody. But again, I think that's where some of the education work that I try to do when I speak with people starts. And to your point is you also have to talk about, you have to have a little bit of a broader vision beyond just, I just want to take your stuff, right? Because that was the question that was asked to you is, oh, were you just taking our stuff? Like, that's always it's just like, well, actually, I'm trying to build something substantial because there's someone who recognizes that your story isn't being told or isn't a part of the national dialogue or the regional dialogue or even the local dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes time to build up trust. Even when you're talking to people like John Hope Franklin, I think John opened up because we'd been able to build up a level of trust between us. And I was reminded actually last night that when I took John to Rentisville, I mean, I was slightly hesitant about asking, but he agreed. I don't think he was particularly jumping for joy about the idea of Rentisville, but he realized the value for audiences to know something about these all black towns. So when I went and came back and went back to London, let's say the broadcast was in 2 months' time. So I was in the process of editing, but I'd written a press release. This is the process. You write a press release, you give it to the press office, they send it out 3 weeks before broadcast. Between sending that press release out and broadcast, a newspaper article appeared in The Guardian. A journalist had picked up the press release, a journalist called Ian Katz at The Guardian. He'd picked up the press release, contacted John Hope, contacted the people in Rentisville, the mayor, Mildred, and flew out to meet John, went down to Rentisville, got back to his desk in London, wrote the article, published the article, didn't mention the radio documentary. And then John phoned me and he said, this fella, is he doing a piece on our documentary? And I said, no. And then he told me what had happened. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry. I thought he was I thought he was doing our thing. I thought he was telling a story about our documentary. So to your point, John, this guy just jumped in and he took what he wanted. You know, he then became a very senior person at the BBC. He now pretty much runs Channel 4 News. But John, I know, wouldn't have done it had he not known that there was no connection. So it's always a problem for members of the public to feel that they're in some way being taken advantage of. You know, somebody's just taking stuff, the most valuable stuff, really, from them for their own benefit, whether it's an institution or or a journalist further in their own career. It's troubling, and it's something that always happens.
I wonder if you could say more about the Rentisville project and what you were capturing when you were there, because I'm curious.
Well, that picture, by the way, before we go any further, if you look at that photograph, you would have thought that I'm about 6'5". But in reality, of course, John was, 6'2", 6'3", maybe? He must have been stood in the ditch. But anyway, it's not quite as it is. But I wanted to go because I received my brother sent me an article about an all-black town called Bowley. And I'd been reading about John for some time, and I knew that he was also born in one of these all-black towns. So I was just desperate to know more about him, and it just seemed like a very simple, straightforward pitch, in a way, to go back with him and spend a day. We spent, I would say, about 6 hours.
What year was this?
1998. So we drove from Tulsa. We met in Tulsa. I drove, and when we arrived in Rentisville, 100 or so people, maybe more, were there to greet him. Some knew him, some didn't, some had books to sign. People were thrusting grandchildren at him, and he was a celebrity in town. and people were incredibly emotional about seeing him. And a lot of handshaking, a lot of stories being told, a lot of memories that were coming from people that John couldn't really recall, or but it was just a wonderful occasion to see how people received him, but also for him to take me to certain places. He took me to 3 or 4 different locations to tell me certain stories that he wanted to share. I played a clip yesterday where he took me down to the railroad track, and he told a story about him and his mother and his sister. They used to have to get the train to go 10 miles up the track to get their provisions. But on this occasion, they were thrown off the train because they'd got into a white carriage. And the conductor said, "You're in the wrong carriage. You should be in the Negro carriage." And his mom said something like, "Well, we're here now." And the conductor wasn't really having that. Slowed the train down, let them off. They thought that they were going to be let onto another carriage, and the train just went. But it was a moment for John where he cried because of this. He said this was a very mean man. He was very upset. He cried, and his mother told him never to cry at things like this. This is not on you, but it's on him. It doesn't take anything away from you, but it takes a lot away from this other person. So he, I guess because of the level of trust that you build up with people, like John, he, I think, intentionally wanted to tell that story and go down to the place where it happened. And that's what we did. Is that the sort of thing you wanted to know?
Yeah, absolutely. Just reading his autobiography, his memoir, and knowing that I got the sense, at least, and I didn't know him personally. He fortunately passed away before I got to Duke, but that it felt like he had really mixed emotions about Reynoldsville as a place.
Very, I would say.
For somebody who clearly had aspirations beyond a place like Reynoldsville, and knowing that the instance about the train, and just for him, the idea of living in a segregated world made no sense. But he understood that that was the world that he was born into, and that he had to sort of navigate that world in a particular way.
One of the things that he did talk about was that, to pick up on your point about the ambivalence he had towards the place, was that he knew that his father and mother and the other parents, who were, many of them were professionals and very well educated, they poured absolutely everything that they had into the children of Rentersville. So he did say to me on several occasions that actually he couldn't have had a better education, because the teachers and the lawyers and the engineers who'd chosen to go and live there, even though they didn't really have many opportunities to better themselves, they decided, well, our purpose now is to teach our children, teach the children of this community. And they basically gave them everything. And he was always grateful for that.
I want to ask a question about absences in the archives. On the one hand, these days I talk about archives as being maroon, right? We're actively trying to seek them as if they're purposely hiding, in plain sight. Sam Cooke, for instance, did one live performance of A Change Is Going to Come on television, not knowing what the song was going to mean to anybody. After he did that, the station where he did the performance didn't think it was a good idea to maintain the archive. So there's no actual footage of that. You mentioned, beforehand about John Hope being in London. the day of the March on Washington and doing BBC television, but not being able to find a copy of that. And both of you have talked about this idea of value. Who finds value in our archives? Who's in the best position monetarily, financially, to actually curate our archives in a way that they're sustainable? I always get a feeling with some of these more corporate entities that it's, to use kind of black vernacular here, it's always just a bunch of black-ish, right? That they stockpile someplace in a corner in a box that, they know there's some value to it, right? There might be some financial value to it at some point in time, but not enough care goes into it to actually curate it in a way that's meaningful for the people who produce these archives. So how do you navigate those kinds of issues in your own work? Right.
I know that the archives are perhaps the most valued asset of any broadcast organisation. Even within the BBC, an organisation like the BBC, one department, if they needed to use archive, they have to pay. It has to come out of some budget. Each individual show's budget. Archive is incredibly valuable. Even the 4 documentaries that I've made with or about John, they are, for all sorts of reasons, they're tucked away. It's almost impossible to get them out and to make them available.
And when they are available, there's a paywall.
Yeah.
Right.
And prohibitively so. And so there's huge social and political value, I think, in creating archives. It costs money, of course, but if one can create archives that are literally free of those constraints, I think the public value would be just unbelievable. It'd be measurable. It'd be terrific. But that needs unpacking, and that needs figuring out about, because I think there's a lot of mystery really about what an archive is, what could be an archive. But actually it's one of the most important things one could do, I think. You were speaking about, we were talking earlier about archives under people's beds. If that's an African American thing, it's certainly a Caribbean thing. It's under beds, it's in cupboards, it's on top of cupboards. But these are of incredible value. I think organizations know. You can't even go near most archives because it's just too expensive. But I think the sort of work that you're doing with these interviews, it's interesting you say that you didn't recognize them as archives until you'd started, until you were some way down the road.
Yeah.
It's incredibly useful and freely available.
Mm-hmm.
That's extraordinary.
That was something that was really important to us. All of it is housed on YouTube, so just easily available for folks, right? They don't even have to navigate Duke, right, to be able to get access to it.
Right. No, projects that would be, I think the principle, just going back to something like StoryCorps, the principle of StoryCorps, I think, is just amazing. And it's working because there's thousands of people now who go to that facility and record their own stories because it's theirs. They own it. And it's archived for the nation. That's a good thing. I don't know how people access your archive, by the way, John.
I can do a quick commercial if you want.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'll come back to that. I think to the question about absences, when instructors bring their students to the library to do little sessions, it's almost like a show and tell where we bring out materials and lay them on a table, and they get the opportunity to touch and feel, because most people have never really. I love and appreciate the digital platforms that we have, but there's nothing more visceral than picking up a book, right? Like, just and knowing that, oh, this is Langston Hughes's book, like this is his actual copy. So for an 18, 19-year-old, just the idea of being transported. I remember one time we were in a class session, and we had a scrapbook album, like newspaper clippings, old school albums. And one of the students said, what is this? Like, why would anybody do this? And the only thing I could think to tell them was, I said, that's an Instagram page.
Right.
In
right.
2D. In 2D. And she was like, oh, I get it. And I said, yeah, because someone curated in a book things that they thought were interesting.
Right.
And pasted it in there. Like, she just couldn't understand the concept of a scrapbook. Like, just didn't, right? So I'm glad that thought came to me, because I was struggling with, like, how don't you understand? But anyway, but I often talk to students about when they have to write papers and they have to use primary sources, et cetera. I say, it's as important to talk about what you couldn't find as it is of what you could, right? Because just think of how much more scholarship we might have if a courthouse hadn't burned down in 18 whatever or 19 whatever, right? So you also have to get to the root of, like, well, why is that absence here? Is it because natural disaster? You mentioned the Caribbean, like climate change is a big deal, okay? We might get to a point where we can't have certain things near coastlines, right? Is it because the individual didn't want anybody to know anything about them? Or is it because, Big Mama died and the family comes around and they go, well, let's just chuck it in the trash? That happens all the time, right? Because nobody wants to deal with it. Or is it because there was a curator who had an opportunity to look at something and could not find value in that thing? And like I said earlier, it doesn't have to come here, but let's talk about some places where it could come, or where it could go, rather, because the story needs to get told. And so, yes, the value is monetary, but it's also just we're missing this thread of our stories, specifically as Black people, that it's just gone, like a flash in the wind, right? That it's just not there. And thankfully we're at a point now where we can capture our stories, but it really does take people to say, and which is unfortunate, and those people don't have to be in an institution. It could just be that community that says, no, this is really important, right? And so it might not ever get to someone in my position who's at a university, is well funded, et cetera, but it really might just be, hey, this is important, this is valuable to us, not just on a monetary level, but because without this body of work, we can't tell our story, the story of our community, the story of place, how we went from point A to point B. I was having a conversation with our head of collections a couple months ago, and I was just thinking about, I wonder how much the Obama memorabilia market is going to look like, now that we're coming up on almost 20 years of his first election, right? Everybody kept the paper, right? Or a lot of people kept the paper, not everybody, because some people were sad about it. I was happy and jubilant, right? But I promise you, auction houses and book dealers, you're gonna start seeing them in catalogs. You know, the audacity of hope, and this costs this much. And going back to the original question of like how you change the archive, the the dirty, dirty truth is that we still don't have equity when it comes to how much we pay for collections. That particular people are going to draw a bigger number than others, which is unfortunate. Um, so that's another reason that there's an absence, that someone has set a market value so high that there might only be two places in the whole world that could afford it, right? And so if nobody can pull together scraps, to think about the Johnson Publishing Company, that was almost gone. They shut down, they closed their doors. The Ebony Archive, the Jet Archive, just floating in the wind for about 2-3 years until the Getty and the National Museum of African American History and Culture stepped in and was able to pull together money, and now it's sort of split between the two.
Friends at Mellon and
Right,
Ford.
that's right. But it took a collective of people.
And it took black leaders of Mellon and Ford.
That's right.
right,
right.
To recognize the
That's
value
exactly
of it.
right. Yeah.
We just posted an episode of Left to Black. Black woman historian wrote a book on black women and the history of yoga. Right, really kind of interesting dynamic. And one of the key points of the book that we promote, reproduce the archival photo in the episode, is of Rosa Parks in her late 60s doing a yoga lesson. Right, she's on her 1970s version of a yoga mat. You can see various black women on the side. And the way that fills in a historical narrative, right? Rosa Parks lived till she was 90, right? How do you begin a political career that begins with gathering the stories of black women who were raped in the South 20 years before we know who she is in terms of Montgomery, right? And everything that she represents, right? How did she maintain it? Well, she did yoga, right? So it becomes this little sliver of information in the archive. Right, that if Professor Evans doesn't do the research, right, that if we don't find value in the book, that we need to spend a half an hour to talk to her, right? Folks who won't read the book necessarily might watch the episode and go, okay, I need to find out a little bit more about this, right? And then all the other historical figures, right, who were important to introducing yoga to black audiences, right, to black communities.
It's very important that when you're in those, when you have the opportunity, and me and my brother were very fortunate to meet.
Does everybody know who your brother is?
I do.
Because I'm sitting there the whole time, I was like, that looks like Carol.
Yeah, that's my brother, Tony Phillips. But when, I should get him to say this, but when we were privileged enough to sit with Rosa Parks and talk to her about the Montgomery bus boycott. There are so many ways, in a way, of asking about that.
Mm-hmm.
And had we gone in as reporters or archivists, had we gone in and said, okay, so this happened on December the 1st, 1955, what happened later that day? What happened next? She would have told us. I'm sure she would have told us, but it's what she's been asked for years.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that the question was framed was, talk to us about that day. Talk to us about the lead up to that day.
Brilliant. Yep.
So it immediately created space for her to tell the story how she wants to tell the story, rather than us assuming we know everything. We know this story. Yeah. And actually, one of the first responses she gave to that question was, I did it before, you know.
Right.
And I was... And then she named some date, 1943, same bus, same driver. That wouldn't have come had we asked it another way. In other words, the motivation is not about us telling Miss Parks how much we know about her, but it's about giving her the opportunity to tell it how she wants it to be told.
And yet there is that appeal to letting her know that you know.
Yeah.
You know enough of her and respect enough of her to know her story, right?
Well, I think I managed to do that just in the invitation.
Yeah, right.
So we're not idiots. I mean, I may have said that. We may well be idiots, but it was enough to get us through the door.
Right.
And I think if she suspected that we truly were idiots, she would have said no.
May, one of the things that's so striking about what you've all said is something about this sort of art of conversation in terms of opening things up. We tend to think of archives as as you've all said, also as institutions where decisions are made about what you include and what you don't include, about what is lost and what isn't lost, about what was never imagined to be important enough to be a part of an archive, or something that was. And you've all said something about, and I've seen also in practice that you all try to create space in a certain way, right? I mean, that seems to be about a shift in the technology of the archive, in a sense, right? That it's deliberately not about foregrounding a decision to include or not, or exclude, but actually to open up space. John, you talked about this in terms of inviting people to say why it is they would, what kind of work they would want these materials to do. Tony, certainly in what you just said about giving space, and in Left of Black, certainly there is that sort of sense of a respectful introduction that demonstrates that you've taken the time with the work that's been produced, but also a dynamic of conversation that is both staged and realized. And I mean, I suppose something that's interesting to me is the way in which, on one level, you're talking about an exchange with one other person, or, I mean, you're talking about being with Carol as well, but certainly, basically, the people who are asking questions, and the person who's responding. But then there is this sort of other triangulation through the institution as well. And you're all working with different institutions. And I wondered if you could just sort of say something about the specificity of a library versus another kind of, I mean, a university library as opposed to another kind of archive, a web-based project that has its own kinds of, that is its own institution, right? Even if it's an open access one. And then the different kinds of institutions that you've worked with, whether it's BBC or something else.
I could start. So I think in my career, I've worked at a state archive, a private archive, which is owned by a company, and now it's special collections at a private university. And the things that make each of them different is that they all really have different missions. So the State Archive I was in Maryland, so their focus is Maryland history. With the Afro newspaper, that archive was just about the institution itself. And the work of the publication. And frankly, I'm a 19th century historian. I didn't want to have anything to do with the 20th century because, as I told my cohort in grad school, I didn't want anybody alive coming back telling me that I got it wrong. So, but it was when I got to the Afro, I learned about the 20th century in a way that I couldn't have in a classroom because the Black press as a whole, the Afro specifically, because of their position based in Baltimore and DC, anybody who was coming from New York down to DC signed the visitor book and the institution. And so what was clear from the very beginning, even before I took the job, I took like a tour. I had a chance to visit the archivist who was there before me. You could just feel like this essence of Black history that permeated the whole institution. And so working here, as you asked before, like, what is the challenge? One of the challenges is, okay, well, now I have to, in some instances, not even mention the Duke part, right? Like, you say the loud thing quiet, and sometimes you have to say the quiet thing loud, but that I have to say, okay, what do you want your archive to do? Like, that's where we start. That's our starting point. Just to throw the whole Duke thing out, because even though our collections are wonderful, and I feel really fortunate to work in a place where we think intentionally about who can use our materials, because even though we have wonderful collections, there is still, especially locally, there are challenges to get to them. Number one, parking is the number one challenge to get to the collections. We don't require you to pre-register. We don't require you to and I know in some European archives, you have to send a letter to the curator to get permission to access. None of that. But finding a place to park will stop you from going anywhere, right? So that's a bar that people have to get over, that, for all of our sakes, really shouldn't be there. But that's for another day. So I would say those are some of the differences. And at the Rubenstein, we have such a diversity of collections that one of my jobs is sort of a tour guide of, okay, it might not say John Hope Franklin Research Center in the catalog record, but because this is a plantation record, you might find African Americans all through these records. So I'm also sort of demystifying the things that we have, and sort of the intersectionality of certain things. Well, because I have an advantage where my colleagues in our collection development department, we have a women's history archive, we have a documentary arts archive, we have a history of medicine archive, we have a human rights archive. And so for someone who sees themselves as not just Black, but they could be a woman, they could be a human rights activist or environmental justice activist, they could be a documentary photographer, we can talk to them from all of our range of perspectives, and that individual knows that they won't just be seen in one light, but be seen across whatever their interests are, which is really, really important, because there are some people who don't just see themselves as one thing, but are interested in having their materials placed where people with different interests can come and use that material. And so those are some of the differences across those kinds of different institutions that I've seen and have really taken to heart.
The audio world, whether it's in the UK or here, is pretty white. That's my statement. No. And It's, there's a lot of expectation about, and a lot of things that have been said about podcasting being this great democratizing force, and it's going to open up access to lots of other people who couldn't get in other words, black people. I haven't really seen much evidence at the moment in any great waves or numbers. So when I got to New York in 2016, to New York Public Radio, as a vice president of content, I was the most senior black person in editorial that New York Public Radio has ever had. And then it was 94 years old. Next year is its 100th anniversary. And that's a disturbing reality for public radio. Because there's an implication that there was no African American good enough or qualified enough to do what I was doing. And that's plainly not true. Things are very slowly changing. Very slowly. And just one other thing about the podcast world is that it's often said it's wild out there, because it is. And one of the reasons it's like that is because you've got a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, a lot of production companies who are springing up all over, but they're not being run by audio people. They're not being run by people who've had a grounding in storytelling, or a grounding in documentary making, or even in radio. It's actually run by marketing people, digital developers. I don't know. It's hard to find people who've made things, but they're running things. And I don't want this to make me sound really old, but there's a lot to be said about radio in terms of the structure. It wasn't perfect, and it isn't perfect, but there's a lot to be said about being surrounded by teams of people who are experienced journalists, editors, researchers, interviewers. There's a lot to be said about that. There's a lot of scope and a lot of opportunities in the podcast world, but they're yet to be taken hold of.
What we've done with Left of Black, there's a logical transition in which you might imagine you've done this independent, working with university. Why not go to a PBS, even a local PBS, local NPR, and do that version of it? And when we talk about these questions of openness and access, I always wanted, not just for me, to have some sort of editorial control over who we were going to talk to, how we were going to talk to them, that would be curtailed, right? If it was in a more corporate setting, right? Why don't you talk to this person? It's like, well, because I don't really want to, right? It's that kind of stuff. And part of that is also thinking about the value of the interview in a way. For seasons 9 and 10, we worked with now Dr. Sasha Panoram, who's a grad student here, who's writing a dissertation on Caribbean literature. But also, I had a real kind of astute sense of what we were doing with Left of Black and what she was doing in her own work in terms of being public facing. So she guest hosted 10 episodes, right, including an episode with your brother that we did in season 10. And for me, that was really important so that folks could see. I never wanted Left of Black to be seen as a vanity project. When we first talked about it here at Duke, and because they were scared of the name, and folks in news and comm are like, Left of Black, is this some sort of leftist politics show? No, I'm just using that as a metaphor, right? If we think about blackness as a certain thing, what we're going to do is going to be to the left of that, right? Blackety black without saying that it's, blackety black. And they were like, well, why not call it the Mark Anthony Neal? Because that's not what it is, right? Left of Black has always been a love project. And what I mean by that is that, you go talk to anybody in PR, a research assistant is going to read the book, come up with 10 bullet points and notes to pass on to, an interviewer. I read the books, right? When we have the conversation, I'm not saying, well, on page 32, you wrote, right? It's not a gotcha episode, right? It's a loving, generous conversation about the work that's conversational, that allows a platform for an individual author to really go on and on about the work that they do, that actually serves as an introduction to the work, right? We're not quick, because the other thing, you have to figure out the timing piece. No one wants to listen to someone talk for an hour and a half, right? You have to be able to figure out the right questions. You have to feel the timing of when to pull the plug, right, for it to feel organic, and then use that as a way for folks to go, well, I really want to hear more from this person. I really want to read this book, et cetera. And for me, if it always had to be governed by that love ethic, right? A love of the work, a love of the scholarship, a love of the contribution that it's making to a broader, body of work in that sense.
Thank you. We could take a couple of questions from the audience. I know we've had you going for a long time now, but yeah.
I just wanted to comment, as I sit here and look at John Hope Franklin, I remember that he was a part of an overnight speaker's invitation for the Center for Senior Life, and it was amazing. Oh, thank you. I had tears as I thought about him jumping on the stage, and he was over 90. And this was 2 years in a row that he did that. So when you're looking for pictures for an archive, that I have some from that event. So I was sitting here thinking how we could produce pictures and the community could, because I also ate lunch at his home one day with he and his family. So it was amazing. And then at North Carolina Central, one of the textbooks was written by John Hope Franklin. So it's a lot of history. We just need to find a way to bring it together. So I'm here to help.
Let's talk.
Okay, glad to.
I guess I'm a little curious as to a lot of what you all highlighted about archival work, whether privileging marginal voices or, connecting to a particular place and formulating listening projects, or Black ephemera that might be stored in, a back locker or underneath a bed. Like, how do you all, is there like various approaches that you all take in determining what stories you find to be really important to tell, that you want to connect to archive? Is there, specific histories that you all are investigating and looking to really connect with? Or I know, John, you were mentioning people bring material to you all the time and want to find that importance in that because of that legacy. Yeah. So how do you all kind of adjudicate where to go, where to connect, what stories to tell and bring alive?
Sometimes you don't know until it happens. I mean, in most of the stories that I have told, I set out with my own, if you like, agenda. I think this is the story. And that story might be, that story might well be just taking John Hope Franklin down to Rentisville to talk about his childhood. But I always leave enough space for myself and for him to tell me other things that I didn't know about and he didn't know about until that moment. In other words, you've got to put in time there for the unexpected. And quite often the unexpected is where the good stuff is. What's actually happening is that there's a kind of dance, if you like, between the producer and the interviewee. In this case, if John is an interviewee, where the mood might take him, the moment might take him to say, okay, I'm going to take Tony down to the railroad track now. I didn't fancy it an hour ago, but actually now I think I will. I didn't know about the railroad track until he took me down there. I certainly didn't know that Rosa Parks had done anything before 1955 like that. So you got to go in with an expectation by the way you frame yourself, actually by the way you physically present yourself, as somebody who's open to change and open to be led down various little alleys. That's how I do it.
I think for me, and in libraries and archives, most of us are governed somewhat by collection policies. So I actually have to revise mine in a couple weeks. So the policy in and of itself is really meant to give you some boundaries of things that you will attempt to collect and things that you might turn away. And sometimes it's not really about value, but as an archivist, I feel like you have a responsibility to take care of the things that you can take care of. So as an example, we don't collect artwork because that's not what we do. The other repositories that are far better and have invested time and resources and staff to collect art. So I would rather steer an individual in that direction. That's the first layer of how you can actually say no, because sometimes you really do need to say no. You do. It's hard, but you do need to say no. The other thing is that, to Tony's point, is sometimes it really helps to just talk to people, like, okay, tell me about this. What is it? One example that I would use in terms of collections is the Cortland Cox papers as an example. So Cortland Cox is the current chairman of the SNCC Legacy Project. He was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 60s, worked in Alabama, Mississippi, responsible for one of the co-organizers of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And so Cortland has papers and he wanted to donate them. None of his papers have anything to do with SNCC. The organization is all his life after SNCC. So one of the things that Cortland was responsible for, he was the Secretary General for the Sixth Pan-African Congress in 1973. And so if I had approached Cortland with just his SNCC life on my mind, then I might have looked past this other really important stuff because it wasn't SNCC, it didn't fit in that box. And you also have to have an understanding of how things that you know this person for actually affected everything else that they did in their life. So Cortland carries a movement ethos in everything he does after the 60s. So even though the SNCC stuff isn't there, you'll find it in the reports that he writes, all the materials that he has related to Six Pack, because for all intents and purposes, it was kind of like a SNCC extension because there's so many SNCC people mixed up in the organization of that. So you really have to be open to your point. You have to really be open to, like, I approached you. I know you for this. Well, I didn't save any of that, but I've got this other stuff. And you can't just, okay, well, just tell me about it and let's talk that through.
That's that connective thread that
Yeah.
you were talking about before. That's that continuum.
Right.
We live in a world of analytics, and everything in the digital world, at least in terms of content, is dictated by eyeballs and likes. How do you take something to introduce to young folks who only understand the world now in terms of Instagram or even worse, TikTok? And I think at some point you have to make a decision that what you're doing is not that. You can find moments, one of the things that Eric Barstow has done this year is that he's done these short little minute long clips that we use to promote different episodes. We actually did a clip early in the year on a book about Chicago culture, and the author made a comment about Afro pessimism, and we got more reaction to that minute long clip than we had gotten from any of our individual episodes ever. Right. And so you figure out how to do those kinds of things. But when all is said and done, this is not a project that's about eyeballs. Um, and I take some great pride in that's our motivation, right? We haven't had really, really, really famous people on the show, right? Though it might have helped the show, right? That's not our intent. Those folks don't need Left of Black. Those folks got NPR, they got CBS. I mean, they got all these other entities to help them sell books. We're not so much selling books, right, as we are trying to introduce people to a body of work, right, that we call Black Studies. And particularly in partnership with university presses. 90% of the authors who come on the show did books with university presses, who both don't have the resources to market many of the authors, and certainly don't know how often to market their Black authors or authors who are writing in Black studies. And so me, that's always kind of the line in terms of what we're looking for. Right? And rarely do brand new books, because sometimes it's books I want to be able to spend some time with and have a clear sense of how we're curating a season. Right, so all the episodes that we've shot this year, right, the decisions on which books we're going to use were decided basically in July. Occasionally there'll be some opportunities to take advantage of people who are coming to town and things like that, but it really is about giving back to Black studies more than anything.
Hi. So earlier, John, you talked about like finding a fit between the material someone may be giving you and maybe the purpose of the archive. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how people articulate the value of the things that they're providing you and maybe how they imagine a larger story.
So value as a duplicitous. Some people outright will give me a price tag. And actually, that makes my job easier because I can say, we ain't got it, right? We don't, But I think it just goes back to what we were just talking about letting people tell their story. You also, as a curator, you do need to have like some subject knowledge of, in my case, Black history. Like I need to be up and do the reading and understand the continuum and the timeline and how things connect and all that good stuff. So if we're not talking about, if money's not on the table, right, then the way that people will generally articulate value is, they really just tell me their life. They talk about their process, how they came into whatever work that they came into. It's a little bit easier for scholars because most scholars have a CV, so I can see like the trail of where they started in academia and where they are now, and that arc. But for people who aren't, like in the case of our SNCC collections, most of those people left academia to get involved in the movement, and then their life took them in a range of pathways. So the way that they generally articulate it is they talk about people they work with, organizations that they work with. They talk about what they were trying to do in the moment when they were engaged in that work. And it's just similar, I'm sure, with one-on-one interviews and you know, and we're involved in a project now. We're trying to record the stories of activists across different generations, and we were having a planning meeting in FHI 3 years ago, and one of the SNCC vets just sort of articulated how, this is in 2019, so it was before George Floyd, that they got involved in the movement in the 60s because of Emmett Till. The young people of contemporary moment in 2019 got involved in the movement because of the death of Trayvon Martin. And now we see like a different generation get involved in George Floyd. Now, if you were to look at them in silos, you would just say, oh, well, this movement happened because of George Floyd. But you got to know the continuum. Like, you have to be able to string all those pieces together and see, oh, they actually have far more in common than what's on the surface, right? And they know that too. So, and just generally, I like for people to just tell their story in general. That's how I learn. I'm not a fantastic reader, but if you sit down and we talk, I'll keep it. And so that's for me how I can string together those things.
To thank everyone. I don't think there was another. No. Okay, good. I want to thank you all so much for coming and participating in this conversation. It's really been very, very rich, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we all have.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.
Thank you.
That's great.